Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to oped.tv. People are still asking, how did a candidate as tarnished and apparently unprepared as Donald Trump get elected President of the United States? How did someone as capable and experienced as Hillary Clinton, whose popular vote advantage was more than 2.5 million, manage to lose to such a candidate? And what does a Donald Trump presidency portend for certain groups who, at the moment, are anxious to say the least? Those groups include millions of women, immigrants, racial and ethnic minorities, America's Muslim community, and others. We'll talk about these matters with my guest, Christina Greer, a professor of political science at Fordham University here in New York, and the author of the book, Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the American Dream. How are you, Professor?
I'm great, thank you.
Thanks for coming in. I really appreciate it. So we've had a few weeks to think things over, to digest matters, and to allow the results of this election to sink in. So I'll ask you the easy question. Give us your best analysis of what happened. How did Trump win this election?
Right.
How did Hillary Clinton lose it?
Well, I think we're all still processing. So I think Trump tapped into something that's really deep in the American foundation. And so if we remember back to 2008, where Barack Obama seemingly came out of nowhere and really tapped into hope and change and really galvanized people who felt like they'd been left out of the two-party system and sort of the political structure writ large, and really inspired them to come out. And, you know, as we saw in the polls, a lot of them were first-time voters.
Right.
Donald Trump actually did the same thing, but with a different group of people, primarily white voters, not just lower economic voters, but just white voters who felt like the two-party system wasn't really speaking to their needs. The candidates of the past were all pretty stale. If you remember when he was on stage with the 16 other Republican candidates, he seemed like the only 21st century candidate on that stage. He was electrifying for a lot of people. He didn't play by the rules. He wasn't a part of the status quo. And so a lot of people wanted this shakeup, and he really, for sort of lower income whites, he tapped into this sort of white male prowess, sort of let's make our country what our country should be, going back to say the 1930s, and using, you know, people call it racialized dog whistling. I mean, he used a dog bark, and it worked. It was not a whistle at all.
A whistle, right?
You know, there are questions as to whether or not he actually really wanted the presidency, but he loves the attention.
Right.
And he had an advantage in the sense that he's been in our homes for 12 years. As a leader, as someone who has, you know, capitalized on the American dream, as someone who is rich, who's got a beautiful third wife, he keeps upgrading, you know, so all these things that people who aren't necessarily happy with their lives have tapped into. And then when you think about wealthier Americans, white Americans in particular, who voted for him, he's saying things that they like. You know, he's going to change the tax code and make it such that their lives will be a lot easier. And then we have sort of the middle class group that definitely wasn't satisfied with Hillary Clinton. We don't have a strong third-party system in this country, even though we did see Stein and Johnson sort of, you know, make some inroads. I think probably total 5% when you add them all together. And so Trump actually excited a lot of people. And they happen to be people in swing states. And so he went to those states and spoke to their economic needs and issues, and for some, their racialized identity or racist identity,
right.
And it worked.
Well, it seems to me that, for me, the easiest thing to understand about the election are, one, the tax cuts for the higher income voters, and two, sort of the racial aspects of it, the racial animus of a lot of the Trump voters. I mean, at least I can sort of comprehend it. But time and again during the primaries and during the general election, something would happen that the media and much of the population at large thought would have been disqualifying, and certainly would have been disqualifying for some other
traditional candidate.
Yeah. Why were they not disqualifying? Well, for example, so wealthy people who want the tax cuts, you know, who are going to get a windfall from a Trump administration, why weren't they worried about his unfitness for office? Or, you know, along with so many other
some
people.
real concerns. I mean, you know, I thought the nail in the coffin would be when he criticized John McCain.
Right.
Who's an American war hero, and this is well before criticizing the Khan family. You know, the thing is, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that Trump voters have, especially when you think about female Trump voters. It's not surprising that white women voted for Trump. I mean, they have been voting Republican since 1952. In only 2 years, according to some research by Jane Junn from USC, only 2 years have white women voted for the Democratic candidate over the Republican candidate.
But Hillary
64
barely won
in 96.
college-educated white
Yeah.
women. I think it was 51%, something
And
like that.
she didn't really go after them at the same time. I mean, if you think about sort of where she went wrong, and I have a feeling people will
Which
be
was my
talking about
next
this
question, so
for
go
quite
ahead,
some
right.
time. But I think she took for granted that women would be on board. And she didn't really go out. I mean, she had these signs, stronger together. Who's stronger together?
Right.
What does that mean? It's a little amorphous. And unfortunately, because so many people have known Hillary Clinton in so many different iterations, some of it is completely unfair and gendered. But a lot of people, her distrustworthiness factor is through the roof. So even before she was the presidential nominee, I think a lot of Democrats were quite worried that she wouldn't be able to have a successful run just because her net negatives were higher than any presidential candidate we'd seen in quite some time. This is why Bernie, a 75-year-old senator from Vermont who's been in office for 40 years and hardly anyone had ever heard of before, sort of came out of nowhere as like the young grandpa, essentially,
Right.
who, had a rhetoric which really tapped into some real deep divisions in the Democratic Party, with some people wondering whether or not we should, if you're a big D Democrat, act like one. You should be on the left,
Right.
as opposed to these centrist,
Right.
neoliberal, middle of the road Democrats, much like Bill Clinton. And much
Yeah, I've
like
been
Barack,
trying to push
and
that
much like
issue.
Barack Obama in
I agree.
quite a few ways. And so some people, if we think about parties that say like a distribution curve, where it's a bell curve and the vast majority of voters are in the center, we know that in the primaries people come out on the extremes, and that was sort of Bernie on one side and Donald Trump on the other, and Hillary Clinton was pretty much a centrist. Bernie pushed her to the left, but there are a lot of Democrats who really wanted her to be a lot more to the left. In the past, it has worked for candidates to stay in the center. We saw this is what the trouble that Mitt Romney had. Sort of, he had to be pulled to
Right.
the left by the Tea Partiers, and then it was too much for him to try and
Pulled to
rush
the-
back,
pulled to the
pull to the
right.
right, and then it was too much for him to sort of come back to the center. That's the past politics that we're accustomed to seeing. This particular election cycle, we have an extremist candidate who's not even on the right. He's just in the stratosphere, but he tapped into something that even Democrats, who maybe in the quiet places of their hearts don't want to admit, but maybe they don't like immigration. Maybe they don't want to help Syria. Maybe they do think that, there are too many social welfare safety net programs out there. And so when someone goes to the voting booth, it's their personal choice. And I think the numbers have shown us, especially in these swing states that have gone blue for the past 2 elections, that there are many people who didn't feel like Obama delivered on the promise of the American dream for them.
So they were looking,
and
voters were looking for change in 2008.
in 2016.
Right, I agree. And in neither time, well, we don't know yet about 2016, but I'm pretty sure they're not going to get the change they want.
Right.
But a lot of people did not get the change they wanted in 2008, or during the 2 terms of the Barack
Or
Obama
2012.
administration, or 2012. I agree. The Hillary, of course, would have been the first woman president, and Trump was this openly misogynistic candidate, the most sexist, high-profile candidate I've ever seen in my life.
Someone who has 20 pending sexual assault cases against him.
I mean, unbelievable. You're right. White women have voted consistently for Republicans, but I'm coming at this as someone who grew up or came of age during the feminist movements of the late 60s and into the 70s and beyond. And then it's sort of been remarkable to me how that's kind of faded, and sort of the view of women that the society has right now. So I figured that this would kickstart something, the idea of a first woman president, and then combined with the misogynism of Trump, and it didn't. Why didn't that issue take hold?
Well, I think history has shown us time and time again that white women choose race over gender each time. And so when we think about people like Susan B. Anthony, or the women who are in the first wave of feminism and the second wave of feminism and even the third wave of feminism.
Approaching something that's not that well known.
Yeah, and so, but these different waves of feminists, they've largely been white feminists with very little racialized analysis. And so some, in the past, when we think about someone like Susan B. Anthony, who's a staunch racist, who actually did not want women of color in the movement, and didn't want them organizing and collectively acting. But when you have
presented the idea that black men had the vote before women
exactly,
had the vote.
and we all know how that was a tenuous proposition anyway. And so I think that a lot of people think that gender identity is the sort of primary identity for white women in particular, and that's clearly not the case. We've seen them consistently vote against their own interests and for a racialized space. And so we have to really look at this election and stop removing race and racism from the conversation. This is a candidate
which so many people
they want to make it
do.
about the economy and everything else.
I agree.
But this is a candidate who ran a racist campaign almost from day one. So if you
Literally
voted for
from
him, yeah. So if you voted for him, you were voting for a known racist.
I mean, he became known, with the birther.
So even before, well before day one, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about 2008, 2010, when he really doubled down. I mean, and he's still talking about the Central Park Five. I mean, this is a man who is a racist, and he's happy with it, and he's put it on full display. If you voted for him, you have to tell yourself that you were voting for a racist. Now, we can use mathematical properties and say if you voted for a racist, you yourself are also a racist. Most people don't want to call themselves racist. That shuts down communication. Fine. You don't have to tell yourself that. But know for a fact that you have now made the leader of the free world. The man's picture will hang in your child's school and in banks and post offices and across embassies across the globe, someone who has denied the legitimacy of our first African-American president for 8 years, someone who has denied the legitimacy of a Muslim soldier who gave his life for this country. This man has never served in any capacity and has gotten 5, waivers for any sort of public service. A man who has never actually done public service. A man who has never studied the Constitution, nor does he really respect the Constitution. And a man who, quite honestly, will sell out this country for 25 cents, if he can have that 25 cents. And so I think that is something where if you will suspend all of these real facts and vote for a racist, misogynist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, unqualified man over an imperfect, overly qualified woman, that says more about you than it does about Donald Trump.
It would have been important if Hillary or someone else had become the first woman president. Mm-hmm. You would get 4 years, maybe 8 years of a woman president. The symbolism I think is extremely important. Is if you look at Obama's 8 years in the White House, I think that was
mm-hmm.
a big deal, whatever your feelings were about Obama's policy. So talk about the difference between the potential of having a woman in the White House for 4 years or 8 years, and what we're going to get is someone who is openly misogynistic. Right. I think not just openly, but gruesomely misogynistic in the White House. What difference does that make if you're looking in terms of the society?
I think it makes a huge difference because descriptive representation matters. Substantive representation is incredibly important, whether or not you represent my interests and my core values, but descriptive representation matters as well because we have a whole generation of children who have grown up with Barack Obama as their leader and their president. One of the reasons why I'm a political scientist is because I grew up and Reagan was my president and he scared me to death. And so I think that's why I chose this profession, to sort of combat that fear of having him as the president. We're going to have a whole generation of students and children growing up where the things that Donald Trump is on record having said could get kids expelled from school. So how can you tell someone not to behave in a particular way or not to do certain things when all they have to tell you is, well, the president said it. I'm just quoting the president, right? So when we have vulgar language, when we have vulgar behavior, when we have sort of Donald Trump encouraging his supporters to beat up dissenters. Right. My 4-year-old niece saw Donald Trump, who she calls Donald Jumpers, on the television.
I love that.
She knew that he was not a good person, and I asked her why. Because all the things that he did, now she doesn't understand upper level policy, I don't think neither does he, but when she's just looking at the television, His body language is such that he's doing things that they're not allowed to do in pre-K. They're not allowed to point, they're not allowed to shout, they're not allowed to cut people off, and they're not allowed to name call. So as a 4-year-old, she's saying that he actually doesn't follow the rules.
Wow.
Because, and so this is on the most basic level of children seeing this type of behavior, right? It's not dignified and it's not worthy of the office, but I don't think he understands what the office actually entails and the weight in which he must comport himself as a leader. I think he's used to being a boss, and that is a very different thing than being a leader. I think he's used to being a salesman, which is a very different thing from being a businessman. And part of being a successful president, as if you read presidential biographies and histories of different presidents, it's that there's a certain level of intellectualism and intellectual curiosity, so that you surround yourself with incredibly bright people who can come to you,
right,
present different ideas. But the decision rests with you because you're the president, but you have to sit and sort of almost meditate on it and really think about it, because your decisions affect millions of people, not just in your own country, but across the globe. This is someone who doesn't really reflect. The last person in the room is the person who, gets the win. I've said this before. Machiavelli said, "Providence is easily won or easily lost." So he's with you on a Monday, not with you on a Tuesday, and he's fine with that. But we're also talking about American democracy and the ways in which we move about the globe, and not just domestically. And that's a really dangerous proposition.
I have thought for a long time that this didn't start with Trump, but it's so clear with Trump. Talking about racial distinctions in this country and racial disparities, unfairness, and discrimination. Try to imagine if a black candidate, or also, if we're going to talk about misogyny, try to imagine a woman candidate who was as ignorant of the issues, as temperamentally unqualified, as openly bizarre as Donald Trump running for president. What would have happened to that candidate?
Well, first of all, if Barack Obama had 5 children by 3 different women, we'd never know who he was. He would never make it to the main stage.
Exactly.
We know this. I mean, we talked about this in 2008 when Sarah Palin's unwed teenage daughter got pregnant.
Right.
Like, if that were Sasha or Malia, he probably would have had to drop out of the race.
I agree.
So we know that there are these racialized distinctions. I mean, keep in mind, Newt Gingrich already called Michelle Obama, when she was First Lady, Barack Obama's baby mama. I mean, like, when you think about the racial assaults that have been going on in just common discourse from Republicans over the past 8 years, it's almost incredible, in the true sense of the word, incredible. And so Donald Trump gets a pass. He has a 46-year-old wife, third wife, who came here, possibly not documented,
Right.
Lied about her credentials, said she misspoke. I don't understand how you misspeak. Either you went to college for 4 years or you went to college for a year. You went to college for a year. That
Right.
does not a BA make, right? And so there's just constant lies.
Plagiarize the First Lady's speech.
Speeches plural. We still haven't seen your taxes. I mean, I'm convinced he's a thousandaire, not even a millionaire, right? And so these are things where part of it's the fault of the media for being distracted by all these by the tweets and the minor shenanigans. But part of it is also, this just wasn't where the country was. They didn't care. When he said, "I didn't release my taxes because I'm smart," a lot of people felt that way. A lot of people don't like paying taxes. Barack Obama said the first thing that someone asked him in his first interview, "What's the thing that has shocked you the most now that you've become president?" And the first thing he said was the number of people who don't pay their taxes. Now, imagine if we have a president who's openly boasted about not paying his taxes. What happens if a large percentage of Americans, even more Americans, stop paying their taxes?
Right.
This is what separates us from, say, Nigeria. In Nigeria, they don't have a tax code. No one pays taxes. They also don't really have roads the way we have roads, right? And so there are a lot of things in developing nations, a lot of structures that don't exist that we have in America because we pay for them. We pay for our police. We pay for our fire. We pay for our infrastructure. We pay for public housing to a certain extent. And so to have people who just no longer want to contribute to the larger American dream and the larger foundational fabric of this country is a really dangerous proposition if the leader of the country is saying, yeah, I didn't do it, so you might not have to either.
Where did you watch the election results?
I was on New York 1. I spend every
were on the
election
Tube.
night with New York 1, and luckily we weren't on the entire segment. They sort of bop around to different, they were at the Javits Center, obviously, and at the Hilton. I was on a panel with 3 other individuals, just kind of every 30 minutes or so, talking about what we're seeing, and it was not a great night.
I assume that you thought Hillary was going to win, like most people thought Hillary was going to win.
I did, with a caveat.
Same here, with a caveat, but go ahead.
So my political science, Dr. Greer, was pretty confident that Hillary Clinton would win. The numbers said so, the demographics, the popular vote has shown her winning.
Right.
I thought that she'd do a lot better in the swing states. So I did think that Florida would come through, especially with some of the Puerto Rican migration that's been happening in Orlando and sort of certain Cuban Americans of a particular younger generation who aren't as staunchly Republican. I thought North Carolina definitely would deliver. I thought that Pennsylvania actually might deliver since they had been delivering in the past. And I thought Ohio, at that point you don't really need it. And as long as you get all the other states that you're supposed to get, Michigan, Wisconsin, you're not only over the top, you're comfortably over the top the way Obama was, and you're in the sort of 360 range. I'm also a Black American who's born and raised in this country, and I'm 10th generation American, and I'm very capable, or I am very aware of what this country is capable of. They're capable of electing a Barack Obama. They're also capable of electing a Donald Trump, and I was very keenly aware that there was a lot of racialized backlash that would occur in a greater sense than just a Tea Party, and in a greater sense than just the lack of respect that this president has received, meaning Barack Obama. And so my African-American brain definitely thought it was a possibility, considering the vast majority of states they're all red states with just blue cities in these red states. And I think that, I always joke with people when, they're like, I marched with King. I'm like, all these people marched with King. King wouldn't have needed to march if all these people marched with King, right? Of course, everyone voted for Obama. So I was a little skeptical, especially since many people had a strong disdain for Hillary Clinton that they couldn't necessarily articulate, but they were very unhappy with her as a selection as the Democratic nominee. And so I started to get nervous when Virginia was too close to call. Because that let me know that Hillary Clinton was underperforming.
If she was in trouble in Virginia, that was a really bad
You
sign.
have the vice president
exactly
from Virginia.
Who, by the way, didn't seem
but
to
he
show
was,
up in this campaign.
No, not at all. But, he was elected statewide. He was a former governor. So he was familiar, the state's familiar with him. So when they said it was too close to call, that meant the northern part of Virginia was underperforming and that the southern part of Virginia was overperforming. And we know that the southern part is the red part, and the northern part is essentially, I call them the DC expats, the strong blue part. And here we are. I mean, I know that she's leading by a margin, roughly the size of Chicago, but at the same time, that's not in the states that matter.
Exactly. We have to leave it there. I wish we had more time because there are a lot of the questions that we're leaving here as well. So I hope when we invite you back, you'll come on.
I definitely will.
All right, Professor Greer, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. I will be back in a moment with a final word. It was just a little over 2 months ago that the Census Bureau was reporting the very good news that real median household incomes had increased by 5.2% from 2014 to 2015, and that the poverty rate had fallen by 1.3 percentage points. The Bureau also told us that the percentage of people without health insurance coverage had continued to decline substantially. The Affordable Care Act and the expansion of the Obama economy was actually making a decidedly positive difference in the real everyday lives of poor people in America. Unfortunately, that upbeat report is likely to be the last burst of good news that the poor will see for quite some time. Donald Trump, Paul Ryan, and the bellicose tribunes of the hard right will be in complete charge of the federal government come January 20th. And their pathological opposition to the Affordable Care Act, widely known as Obamacare, not to mention their relentless hostility to such crucial anti-poverty programs as Medicaid, food stamps, and unemployment insurance, and their opposition to substantial increases in the minimum wage, will mean long years of devastating hardship for the poor and the near poor. Trump's fundamental take on poverty is that people are poor because they are not willing to work. He said they make more money by sitting there doing nothing than they make if they have a job. That's ominous. The man who is now president-elect does not seem to know that the majority of those who are poor in America are children, the disabled, and people who are elderly. Nor does he understand that many adults who are poor actually have jobs and are working every day. There are also millions of people in America who are jobless but frantically seeking work. There is no doubt that the poor will suffer under the Trump administration. What's still open to question is whether there are enough people who care about the poor who are willing to fight back against this GOP onslaught, or whether we are just going to sit passively by and watch it happen. That's all for now. See you next time.